As you can see, we're missing one person. Assemblyman Tony Thurman is on the 405, and as we all know what that means. So we will start, and hopefully he'll get here when he gets here. So we don't want to delay. We have the room for a limited period of time, so apologies for that. I also have another announcement about if we wanted to tweet this. We have a hashtag CPEG Forum, CEPEG Forum. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Julie Marsh, and I want to welcome you. On behalf of my USC colleagues and co-directors, we have Tricia Birch, want to wave, Morgan Polikoff, and Darlene Robles is actually ill, as well as David Plank, who's the Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education in the back. He's a co-sponsor. PACE is a co-sponsor of this event. And we wanted to collectively thank you for coming today, and to our candidates and to Adolfo for participating. We also wanted to thank the California Community Foundation, as well as the USC Scholars Strategy Network for their support of this event. And this policy forum is actually the inaugural event of our new center, the Center on Education Policy, Equity, and Governance. We call it CPEG. Hence the hashtag. Yay, all right, I like the enthusiasm, thank you. And so CPEG is actually the one center at the USC Rossier School of Education that is squarely focused on education, K-12 education policy. And our mission is really to reduce the opportunity gaps that we see in California for California students by working to ensure that new policies and practices are driven by rigorous evidence, careful analysis. And our goals are really to partner with local leaders to help solve problems of practice. We intend to make research more accessible to policymakers, to practitioners, and to the public. And we're also seeking to train the next generation of practitioners and scholars who are committed to advancing equity through rigorous evidence-based policy. And so we could think of no better way than to launch our efforts than with this event, which is really about a public discussion of what we see as the key education policy issues in the state, and to hear from these candidates about their thoughts and their visions about how to move the state forward in this area. I also just wanted to thank, there's a committee of students who've been involved in putting this event together, and with us and our moderator, to really think through what are those key important sort of education policy issues facing our state. So I just wanted to thank Tasmin Dhaliwal. Tasmin, are you? I don't know where she is. There she is. And Fernando Garcia. I don't know if Fernando's here. Shira Korn. And Sarah Rabofsky, who's in the back. And then finally, I just want to thank Susan McKibben. She's the administrative director of our center. She made all of this happen, and we wouldn't be here without her. So thank you, Susan. I don't know where you are. I think she's out in the back. Okay, and then finally, I just want to thank the Dean of our School of Education, Karen Gallagher, for her generous support of the center and of this actual event. We really wouldn't be here without her. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Karen. She's going to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And welcome to USC. All of us at the USC Rossier School of Education are glad that you could join us this afternoon. And welcome to the first convening. As I'm going to reiterate, this is the first convening of the USC Center for Educational Policy, Equity, and Governance. I want to thank our candidates, Lily Ploski, Assemblyman Tony Thurman when he gets here, and Marshall Tuck. It's this kind of open dialogue, not only with one another on the issues, but also with us on our concerns, with students and parents, with experts and citizens alike. This is essential for achieving our shared goal of improving our schools and strengthening our society. And I would like to acknowledge two people who are here tonight that are important to the School of Ed and are an example of their supporting us, and that is two members of my Board of Counselors, Brent Noyes and Doreen Peterson, and they both are educators in the schools. Thank you. And I want to make a quick shout out. You heard Julie mention all the people that were important, but as you all are aware, if you've ever put on an event, it's staff who get it together. And I would like to thank the staff in the Rossier School as well as the staff at the Radisson. They both did a great job, and I'd like to acknowledge their support and work. And while CPEG was formally launched only in late January, it concentrates the important and impactful work of USC researchers who have been devoting their careers to addressing the challenges faced by educators and policymakers, from local districts and neighboring districts to Sacramento to Washington, D.C. Congratulations to our co-center directors, Professors Tricia Birch, Julie Marsh, Morgan Polikoff, and Darlene Robles, for transforming your own individual efforts into this collective mission. CPEG's adoption of the term equity is purposeful and mirrors USC Rossier's own mission, which is to prepare leaders to achieve educational equity through practice, research, and policy. A gathering like this is representative of the impact that can be achieved in finding connections among these three strands of experts: practitioners, researchers, and policymakers, seeking common ground in the service of improving learning opportunities and outcomes for all students. USC sits in the heart of the second largest school district in the country. While we are a private university, we operate with a very public mission to produce educational leaders for our public schools. Through this work and through an event like this forum, we are all, I think, trying to make a difference for the kids. And now I want to introduce our moderator. Adolfo Guzman-Lopez has been a reporter at NPR affiliate KPCC 89.3 FM since 2000. And his distinct voice is certainly familiar to all of us who follow education closely in the greater Los Angeles area. But his stories have resonance far beyond Pasadena, beyond Southern California, and throughout the state and the country. A side note, I arrived in Los Angeles in 2000 and immediately began listening to KPCC. I started following Adolfo's work because it was relevant, hard-hitting, and solidly researched. He was and is an authentic voice of educational journalism. He has covered many important K-12 issues that intersect with our work on topics such as LA Unified's budget cuts, the school board, teachers' unions, charter leaders, and college affordability. Currently, he is KPCC's higher education reporter. And among his many honors is an award from the LA Press Club in 2006 as Radio Journalist of the Year. At a time when journalism has been under attack, it is essential to validate and support the role journalism can play in ensuring students are receiving the best education possible. Adolfo, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking time to work with the Center for Ed Policy, Equity, and Governance. Thank you for giving input into the Forum Planning Committee, and thank you for your important work as a journalist. Please help me welcome Adolfo Guzman-Lopez.
See, is the mic working? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very generous introduction. Two reasons I said yes when approached by the organizers. The first is that over the years, USC's researchers have been very generous in returning my calls on deadline and have been very good over the years in the many different topics which I've covered. And so I've relied on them quite a bit, so thank you. That was one of the reasons. The other reason is that for Southern California Public Radio, the mission and why we are here today meshes perfectly with what we do at Southern California Public Radio, which is to deal with the important issues of the day, connect people in disparate communities, and to give accurate information, which is, as we all know, is very important right now. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. This is not a debate format, so unlike the presidential debates, you're not going to, there's no podium. It's very informal, but I do have my stopwatch, which I use to put together radio news stories. So I'll generally keep track of, to be able to give you more or less equal time in responding to the questions. Unfortunately, Tony is not here, but as soon as he gets here, we'll fold him in to the discussion. So next to me, as many of you already know, is Marshall Tuck. He's currently the educator in residence at the nonprofit New Teacher Center. He's the former president of the charter school organization Green Dot, which is, I think, the first time I met you and started interviewing you when Green Dot was doing a lot to start schools and take over schools and that sort of thing. And as many of you know, he ran for state superintendent 4 years ago. And next to him is Dr. Lily Ploski. She's the former dean at Solano Community College. She currently teaches in the Upward Bound program at Mills College in Northern California. And she has very strong Southern California roots. She grew up in Orange County and was the director of the Transfer Center at Fullerton College. So thank you very much for both of you for joining us. And the first question is very broad, and I'll start with you, Marshall. Why are you running for the State Superintendent of Public Instruction?
Well, Adolfo, first, thank you for moderating. Thank you, Dean Gallagher, and all the folks at PACE and all the folks at the Rossier School. And thank you all for being here on Monday at 4 o'clock. Frankly, it gives me real excitement and inspiration about what's possible for our kids. We have a full house at 4 o'clock in downtown LA on a Monday, and we are all here for the same thing, which is how do we give every single child a quality education? And we're all here because we believe every child deserves a quality education. And many of the folks in our room I can see work in education, and we know with the right supports, every child can succeed. But unfortunately, that's just not happening today in our state. So tomorrow morning, 6.2 million kids will go to public schools in the state of California, and over 3 million cannot read and write at grade level. Think about what that means for their future. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that in the wealthiest state in the nation, with so many incredible children and so many hardworking educators, how is it possible that we have so many students that are getting left behind? And the answer is, our elected officials in this state have not prioritized our public schools. You know, a lot of people blame our educators for conditions in our public schools, and that's totally wrong. Teachers did not underfund their classrooms. Principals did not smother their schools with red tape. Superintendents did not create the teacher shortage. Our politicians did. And so it's time that we got to get focused on changing the politics of education and truly get people elected who are going to put kids first always. And I think that starts with the state superintendent. I worked in education for 15 years. I helped create Green Dot Public Schools, helped open 10 new schools in Inglewood, South LA, and East LA. 8 of those 10 schools recognized by U.S. News and World Report amongst the better public schools in the country. I left Green Dot in 2006 to work in district public schools because that's where the majority of kids are. And I helped create the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, which works with LA Unified to turn around the lowest performing schools in Los Angeles. Schools like Santee High School, which is just 2 miles away from here. And in 2008, when we started working at Santee, it had 3,500 students, and only 35 were at grade level in math. 35 out of 3,500. We didn't accept this. We brought real change to our schools. We raised more money for our schools. We recruited principals to come work in Watts, in East LA, in South LA. We invested in teacher professional development, brought technology to our schools, launched a parent college to get our parents more involved. And our kids soared. The work of our teachers and our principals and our counselors, they all invested in our kids, and our kids soared. 36% graduation rates in 2008 when the partnership started working at those schools, 81% today. We had the highest achievement in academic improvement of any school system with more than 10,000 kids. That's what is possible in our public schools, and it's possible for all kids, but it requires real urgency and real change. On other big issues, California is boldly leading the way. Think about our climate crisis. Think about healthcare. We are leading the way. It's time for that same urgency, that same commitment for our kids, all kids. Low income, high income, new immigrants, special needs. All students deserve a quality education, and it's time for our state to get serious about not accepting a broken system and elect people who are going to drive real change that our kids deserve. And that's what we're going to do in my campaign, and that's why I'm running.
Thanks. Lily, tell me why you're running for State Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Sure. Well, I'm a single mother, and I'm somebody who probably didn't do as well in education as I could have. I grew up in Orange County. I was born and raised in Orange County. And when I was in my educational journey, I did not feel like I received the type of support and resources that I really needed to thrive. So I almost didn't graduate high school. I actually had to go to adult school. I had to go to night school. I had to go to summer school. One of the problems that I faced, which is I hated math. And math is a tough subject. A lot of kids have anxiety around math. A lot of kids just don't get it. Or they don't have the attention or interest or connection to that subject matter, so they don't feel like it's important to who they are and what their future goals are. So when it was time for me to graduate high school, I was going to night school, I was trying to get my credits, and I was 18, and I had no idea what my life was going to look like. I had no idea what sort of path I would possibly have, but I knew I wanted to go to college. My dad had gone to college. I have 3 sisters and a brother, 2 sisters and brother. They were all going to college. I wanted to go to college. I just didn't have the grades, and I didn't have the money. So I went to a community college. And when I went to community college, my life turned around. I got A's for the first time. I didn't have to take that math class and fail and drop out. I was doing well because I had independence. I could pick my classes. I could pick my instructor. I was going out to get services from the counselor. I was attending events. I was active on campus. And for me, community college was that, oh my gosh, I'm not stupid. I don't have to give up the goal of college. I can pursue whatever I want. And so I got excited about education. And I thought community college is the greatest thing on earth because it let me have a do-over. And with that excitement, that enthusiasm, I was able to go from community college to UC Berkeley, my #1 choice, and that's where I got my bachelor's degree, and I studied women's studies. I studied something I had about in high school. I had never been aware of. What were the women doing in the Civil War? What did the women do during civil rights? What were the women doing? And finally, I was learning those subject matters that were interesting to me, and my brain just woke up. So when I think of education and when I think of kids in the K-12 system and I think of all this pressure, standardized tests, get ready for college, pick your future, you're 18, you should already know these things. How many of your kids when you're 18, you know what you're going to do for the rest of your life? It just doesn't happen, and we shouldn't give up on those kids. Every single one of those kids can do whatever they want. And we need to believe that. We need to have teachers who believe that. We need to have principals who believe that. We need to have superintendents who are going to make sure every single one of those kids has a chance to live the life that they want to live. So I became an advocate, and I became obsessed with student success. So when I was 18 and I was 20 and I was thinking about what am I going to do for the rest of my life, I was thinking I want to have my own school. And I want to run my school and make it the best, most successful school that there is. What do I need to do that? And so I started looking at jobs in education. One of the jobs that really caught my eye was the Vice President of Institutional Effectiveness. And I was 18 thinking, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do institutional effectiveness. What do you need to do that? You have to study, get a PhD, you have to understand research, you have to do analytics, you have to do administration. So I said, that's what I'm going to do. So I got my bachelor's degree at Women's Studies at UC Berkeley, and then I did my master's degree at Teachers College University in New York City. And I studied student personnel administration, and I was also working at Columbia University in a STEM program for students of color who are interested in pursuing technology and math. And I just loved what I was doing.
I have a follow-up question. So if elected state superintendent of public instruction, what's the most powerful thing in that office, and how would you use it? What's the power of that office, and how would you use it?
Do you want me to move away from my introduction and
Yeah,
answer that?
It's more or less, yeah, because I gave you more or less the time that I gave Marshall for the introduction.
Okay, so what we can do as state superintendent and what I think is possible and what we really need to focus on is moving together as one.
Yeah.
And when I say moving together as one, what I'm talking about is we need to set that pathway up for career and college preparation from kindergarten through the K-12, through middle school, through higher education, and we need to pull the resources that we know are already out there. There are a ton of community agencies, parent-backed groups, after-school programs, partnerships with universities such as USC that are supporting a lot of these fantastic outreach opportunities to the inner city, to our high schools, to our middle schools, and we need to lift up the K-12 system. Higher ed has done an amazing job with transfer students. We've done an amazing job with students who are going from university to university, from your undergrad to graduate. And what I think we need to do is harness all that energy and support into the community and to lift up our K-12 system. I just feel like I'm very proud of the work I've been able to do in higher ed, and I've been doing it for 15 years. I've been a student advocate that entire time, but I really feel like we need to look upstream, and I can't complain about our community college students who come in with high school diplomas, and 80 to 90% of those students test in at remedial English and math without saying, what's upstream?
Okay. Marshall, same question. What's the most important power of the state superintendent of public instruction, and how would you use it?
So state superintendent has really three distinct powers. So one is it should be influencing the legislature and the governor on setting the agenda for public schools, working with educators. So the educator voice is the key on setting policy. Secondly, it sits on a number of different boards, Cal STRS, UC Regents, Teacher Credentialing Commission, so you can actually set policy that way. Then third, the state sup runs the California Department of Education. 2,500 employees, $250 million budget, whose job is to support 1,000 school districts in the state. So what do? Step one is we have to get California to make public education the top priority in this state for the next decade. I think that state superintendent pushing the governor and the legislature to get there. We have prioritized the environment. We've prioritized the education, healthcare. It's time to prioritize our kids. Secondly, let's think about what does it take to make the best public schools in the country. That's what California should have. Deep investment in our teachers and principals. We got to get more people to come into teaching. We got to train them better at the university level, and then we actually got to give them a lot more support in their job. And then secondly, let's give much more flexibility to school districts. Right now, the state is very, very bureaucratic-based. It's very, very regulation-based in terms of what it tells superintendents and principals and teachers to do. I want to give a lot more flexibility to the practitioners in the field to truly drive real change.
One of the big issues in schools right now is teacher shortages in math, special ed, science. Those are the main fields. As state superintendent, what would you do to alleviate that shortage?
Yeah, so I've worked in schools for 15 years, and in Watson, East LA, and South LA, we've had shortages in science and special ed for a long time. And I ask people to think about, why do we have a teacher shortage? What's the value proposition for a teacher right now? I'm not going to pay you very well. I'm not going to train you very well, and I'm going to blame you for everything in our public schools that's wrong, right? And we wonder why we have a shortage. We got to completely shift that around. We got to pay teachers more, and I think immediately let's move towards free college for anyone who commits to 5 years of teaching or more. That's only a couple $100 million off a $90 billion budget. It's possible. Secondly, let's really renovate our teacher training programs. Like USC has a great example of here. Like this is a school of ed that does phenomenal work training teachers, but they don't train that many teachers, right? We got to work with our Cal States to truly, really restructure how we train our teachers. And then third is, a teaching shortage is not just about getting people to come into teaching, it's getting them to stay in teaching. In our schools, we said first and foremost, our principals have to be instructional leaders who are going to support our teachers. We know when teachers are supported by principals, they stay in their jobs.
Same question to you, Lily. What would you do to alleviate the teacher shortage?
Tony's here.
Excellent.
I think our teacher preparation programs do need a lot of attention, but I don't think it's about the numbers and the quantity. I was actually in the master's program here at USC in teacher education, and I asked it was an online class, Master's in Teaching Online, and I asked my advisor, how many people are in our cohort? Because when I did my master's program at Columbia University in Teachers College, our cohort had 20 people. And you know, here, the cohort for the Master's in Online Teaching, I think it was 200 or 198. It was a very large cohort of students going through those programs. But what I think is part of the issue is that you're asking people to stop working because you're in a graduate program, but then you also have to do student teaching, and then you also have to do student hours, and then you have to be with a master teacher. And so you're constantly in this rotation of either taking classes, being observed, or working with another teacher. And those students who are taking those classes are ready to teach right away, right? And so you're asking them to put that on hold for 1 whole year. And there are some students who come into that program who have already been substitute teachers for multiple years. And you're asking them, okay, now do a classroom observation, be involved in with a master teacher for student learning, and it's a redundancy of work. So I think with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, we have to look at what are the skills people are coming in with, what is their experience. I wasn't qualified to teach, and I have my doctorate in educational leadership, and that happens across the board. So we need to look at what's the process for our teachers to become teachers, where's the support, where's the retention, and where's the professional development so that we can get people who want to do it, and there's tons of people that want to do it, through that system more clearly.
Thank you. All right, well, let's welcome Tony Thurman. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. So, as many of you know, Tony Thurman is an assembly member from the Oakland area. He also served on the Richmond City Council and was on the board of trustees of the West Contra Costa Unified School District. So, Tony, I gave the other candidates, they took about 3 minutes to answer the question why they're running for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I'm going to ask you the same thing, give you about the same time. So, why are you running for State Superintendent?
I want to make sure we train engineers who can get rid of gridlock and traffic in LA.
That's
When we
very
talk about the
selfish.
work,
Right now, today.
it's related. I think our kids need to be ready for the jobs of tomorrow, and that is one of the places where we need to focus. And I believe that all kids can achieve, and I believe that education saves lives. It literally saved mine. I was raised in a low-income household, an immigrant mom from Panama, a dad who I never met, who I found on the internet. And I didn't fall through the cracks. And in spite of being on food stamps and government cheese, I ended up in the California State Assembly instead of California State Prison. I want to give that type of an opportunity for California's 6 million kids and make sure they get a great opportunity no matter what side of the tracks that they come from. And so for me, my experience has changed, and I could have easily been someone else's postscript. Instead, I get the chance to work with kids every single day and spend 20 years of my career helping them as a social worker, 12 years working in our schools, doing things that matter. You know, we changed the law in this state to say that every young person who was in foster care will get a scholarship to go to college. And I'm very proud of that legislation, and that we will make sure that 400,000 new kids will get access to the free lunch program. If you've been a hungry kid, you know how important it is, and that you can't learn when you're hungry or you've been impacted by trauma. And I'm very proud that my bill last year gave $35 million to 30 different districts to do restorative justice, to keep kids in school and out of the criminal justice system, in places just like LA Unified, which received a $1.7 million grant to do community schools. I want to continue to do that for all of our students. As you heard from my opponent here, we have to address our teacher shortage. We have to close our school-to-prison pipeline. We have to make sure that our students are ready for the jobs of tomorrow. We haven't even gotten to the achievement gap in addressing special education. I want to make sure we give a great education for every single young person in this state, and I couldn't think of a more important job than making our funding in California #1 again. We're 46th in the nation in per pupil spending, even though we're the 6th wealthiest economy. Our kids deserve better, and if you elect me as your superintendent, I'll make sure they get funding that's #1 for our kids in California.
So, Tony, when I was looking at this position, I was looking at it and I'm thinking, well, you know, the main power in education in California is with the state legislature, the governor when they pass laws, the State Board of Education. You know, State Superintendent of Public Instruction heads the CDE. You can argue it's like a souped-up bureaucrat, right? What do you think is the most important power of that office, and how would you use it?
Well, I think the most important power is being a spokesperson for education. We have a Secretary of Education in this nation who is saying that she won't fight for all students, including transgender students, and she doesn't think that it's her job to fight for them. And I think we need someone who stands up, and that's why I started a roundtable this year on how we support our LGBTQ students. And I have a bill that's actually going to provide more professional development to support our LGBTQ students in our schools. So it's important that the Superintendent of Public Instruction stand up to President Trump, stand up to Secretary DeVos to say, we will not allow our education to be privatized in the state of California. We're going to ban the for-profit charter schools in this state and say, you don't make money off of our kids. We're going to make sure that we say public education is not about competition. It's about an opportunity for every single student to achieve, to learn, and to live a great life. And so...
Thank you. So, all three of you have said that you support the local control funding formula, which you could make a strong argument that, you know, since it was enacted in 2014, I believe that it was one of the most, has been one of the most significant reforms in California education. Yet the advocates are some advocates are saying that the accountability needs to be improved, holding school districts more accountable for some of those changes. So let me start off with you, Marshall. What can the superintendent do to improve on local control funding formula from that office?
Yeah, so make sure everybody kind of knows what we're talking about. State actually passed a law that said we're going to give more dollars to the highest poverty kids and give more flexibility to educators to use those dollars wisely. So that law makes a lot of sense. Again, I've worked in Watts and South LA and East LA, and our students need more supports, more academic supports, more social emotional supports. But current state superintendent actually passed a ruling that said that money doesn't necessarily have to follow the kids. And so we have a real problem right now in this state where the intent of the law was more dollars for highest poverty kids, but it's not actually getting that way. So what I will do on day one, which is in my power, is say the money actually needs to follow the kids so our neediest students get more experienced teachers who are going to be there and stay there for a long time, get more mental health supports. In our schools, we actually brought mental health services onto our campuses to make sure we're addressing kids' both academic needs and social emotional needs. Unless the dollars actually get to the schools and the students of need, they won't have the desired impact. And we talk a lot about equity, and equity is the most important thing in our schools. And yet, unless we find a way to have more experienced teachers and principals to be stable on our campuses of highest need, unless we have more mental health services to support those teachers and principals, we will not close the achievement gap. So we have to make sure that money actually gets to those kids, and that's what we're going to change right away, which I have the power to do.
Lily, tell me how you would change local control funding formula, if at all?
Sure, I support what we're doing, but I think we need to really talk about that model having some teeth to it, because there's so little available discretionary funding for education that we're maybe talking about 5 to 10% of a budget when you have 80 to 90% of the budget tied up with personnel. So if you're talking about having committee groups and parent groups and neighborhood groups talking about this 5 to 10% of funding, we need really to address the funding model. And that's something that I think all three of us can agree to, because if you want a local control measure to really have some teeth to it, it has to have some real dollars behind it. Otherwise, you're really making decisions around a very small number of dollars for that overall district budget. The other issue is leadership and stability of leadership, which Marshall mentioned here. The average of our supervisor, I think, superintendent tenure has gone down to like 2.5 years per district. So the risk factor there is that you're going to have new superintendents that come and go, and whoever has the loudest voice is going to get listened to the most, and those monies aren't going to be spent in a responsible manner because they're not going to have the input from the district that they should. And that's one of the biggest issues I see in what we can support as a superintendent is the support of our superintendents, their professional development, making sure that the local control actually has some funding for it, and making sure that it's being spent that way. One of the issues I want to support is fiscal integrity and making sure that people understand how to make budgets. I've worked with superintendents who really have a hard time with that because we aren't taught that and we're not trained on that. We're not businessmen, but we do need to support professional development for superintendents.
Thanks. Tony, how would you change local control funding formula?
I agree. The local control funding formula is intended to support our disadvantaged students, foster students, English learners. There's no question about that. But here's the bigger part of the conversation. LCFF funding only restores us to funding levels from 2008 when we were in the recession. And that will not get us from being 46 in the nation in per pupil spending. We need a permanent funding source to fund education to make it the way it should be so it's comparable to states like New York and states that are our size. Our revenue streams in this state fluctuate because we focus on property tax and sales tax revenue. We need a permanent revenue source that will get us to a place where we can have the right type of funding in our state. And if I become superintendent, one of the first things I'll do is convene a working group of business leaders and government leaders and educators to look at where are our opportunities to generate long-term funding that will take us to number one in per pupil spending. In the meantime, I've been chipping away at it every single year with creative ways to bring in new revenue. This year, I've introduced a bill that puts a tax on private prisons that can help us to generate millions for our schools, for preschool and after-school programs. We spend $6 billion on prison-related services in this state. I think that we can flip that narrative and direct that money to public education until we get our permanent funding source.
Thanks a lot, Tony. And let me remind the audience that we're going to build in the question and answer portion of this forum in just about 10 minutes. Let's see, there are cards in different parts of the room. Raise your hand. Some people. So go ahead and put your question on one of those cards, and those will be collected, and then they will be brought to me, and that's how we'll get your questions in. So Tony, you're making me think of some of the reporting I've done over the years in affluent communities. So So administrators in some public school administrators in affluent communities say that there is a disparity in funding, right? That they are not getting enough for their community's needs. I've also done stories where foundations, they've established foundations that are, filling that gap. But what would you say to those communities about the funding gap towards their needs in public education?
I would change the conversation. This is not an us versus them. We have had an achievement gap where African American students and Latino students and students from low income backgrounds are not able to have the same success as their peers from other groups. That doesn't mean that they can't learn. They can. But when you're facing social economic barriers like poverty and violence in your community and homelessness, those things get in the way. And so equity, yes, we need to have it. And the model of LCFF is moving in the right direction of saying prioritize, students from disadvantaged backgrounds to get this funding, the supplemental grants and the concentration grants. All I'm saying is if we don't have the whole conversation about broadening funding for education in all of our communities, I think that we are missing the conversation that we should have. And if you look at something like STEM and STEAM education, for example, which I think can be a great equalizer for kids of all backgrounds, and that's why I'm asking the state to give $200 million to our school districts this year to do professional development around computer science so our kids can enter the coding profession. I'm also asking our state to spend $500 million every single year on career technical education so our kids get hands-on opportunities and internship opportunities and real career ladders that will help to close the equity gap in our school district and our states.
Lily, what do you think about some of these communities, saying that there should be more funding in their schools in some affluent communities?
Well, that happens across all sectors of education. It also happens in K-12 as well as community college. We have different sources of funding into education. You can have a general fund pocket of money, and then you can have foundation pocket of money, and then you can have private co-sponsorships, and you can have revenue from different opportunities as an institution of education. One of the issues is something that came up with the Serrano decision and around basic aid and parcel taxes that have been out there. We're having different social capital in different social environments. So when you have a high income neighborhood and school system, obviously their social capital and their wealth within that area.
They're more successful
Right,
at passing parcel
exactly,
taxes
they're more
and taxing
successful and they
themselves.
have more opportunity for them to develop alternative funding models. But what about those low income or those neighborhoods with disproportionately impacted students in terms of the racial disparity of economic and educational growth? We need to focus on equity across the state of California. Many places in Los Angeles, you can have one school across the street from the other school, and they're just having, so many different funding opportunities based on the partnerships and people on their board, people who are on the school board and the opportunities that they have to represent their school district. So I think we need to have educations for professional development for our superintendents. We have to have integrity within our fiscal planning, and we have to understand how we tie our planning to budget. I think that conversation happens in every educational community of how we're linking in our expenses and our budget spending.
Thanks. Marshall, what's your response to?
So I tell our middle class and upper class communities, they're right that they don't have enough money. I mean, our state is 41st in per pupil funding in the country. We're the wealthiest state in the nation. If you go to Manhattan Beach, they have a 600-to-1 ratio of students to counselors. That's not good enough. So we have to increase the overall funding level. The way state funding works, you have a base funding level, and then you get supplemental and concentration grants for poverty. The base level is too low. So we should lift it up for all school districts, high income and high poverty, and then continue to add additional dollars above and beyond for our highest need students. So the reality is it's not an either or. Should this neighborhood get more of that? We have to increase the overall funding. California should be top 10 in funding per kid in the country. We have the highest rate of poverty adjusted for cost of living of any school system in America. We should have amongst the highest funding, more for higher poverty students, but more for everybody. That's the way all kids soar and have success.
Okay. So I'm going to be giving you just a short amount of time because we want to get some more of these questions in and then get the audience's questions. The next questions are directed to each of you individually. So, Marshall, your critics, because of your work on Green Dot, because of your work with Mayor Villaraigosa, say that if elected to state superintendent, you're going to give away the store to charter school interests. How do you respond to that criticism? And tell me specifically, do charter schools need any more regulation that you would carry out?
Yeah, so I've worked in education for 15 years. The majority of that time in district public schools, not charter schools. So I like to kind of, correct the record up front. I believe the question for all of us is, how do we have a great public school for all kids? Whether the public school is a traditional district school, a magnet school, or a charter school, how do we have a great public school for all kids? And I believe that high-quality charters run by nonprofit organizations, particularly in our highest poverty neighborhoods, can be a benefit to the public education system. But it's still, the question fundamentally has to be, does a school have high-quality teaching with principals that support that school? Does it have a program that is truly embracing and giving kids a 21st century curriculum? Are they accepting all children? So we have to think about a system that works well. I have a 6-year-old son. He goes to our local public school in LA Unified. And I think that's a good thing. That's the right school for him. I also know a lot of people who send their kids to charter schools, and they feel good with that. When we think about policy, how do we change policy so it's not this charter or district, but it's a collective public school system for all kids? Increase funding. We certainly need to actually have regulations for some charters. No for-profit charter schools. That makes sense. Making sure if a school district is losing enrollment, let's hold them harmless for a little while. We've actually seen that in other areas. If a school district loses enrollment, to actually have them be held harmless.
There have been quite a few instances of fraud in charter schools. Anything to be done on that level?
I think for our district schools and our charter schools, we should have zero tolerance for fraud. Zero tolerance. And if there's any issue where people are misusing public funds, they should be shut down immediately and frankly put in jail. I mean, our kids deserve every single dollar we have towards them in the classroom, not towards bureaucracy.
Thank you. So, Lily, the position of state superintendent is an administrative position. So you'd be overseeing a big department and acting as a lobbyist of sorts for education in the legislature, up and down in the assembly, in the Senate, or the governor. Arguably, you don't have any formal experience in either of these two. Is that a disadvantage for you?
Sorry, what are you asking me if I have an experience in what?
In managing a department as large or managing an organization as large as the California Department of Education?
Well, when you run administration, you have to sit on committees, you have to meet with the board, you have to meet with community members, you have to meet with parents, you have to meet with students. And no matter what size of an organization you're running, those same type of roles and work with the same type of leaders. I've worked at colleges where we had 25,000 students, 6,000 students, 7,000 students. In my last position, I was the dean at Solano College. I had 150 direct and indirect reports. I was also the athletic director. I also worked in the community. I also oversaw early childhood education and the children's program. So I have an experience working on statewide committees, statewide boards, statewide interest groups where we're trying to lobby and support the educational mission. So whether or not I have 1,000 people reporting to me or 150 reporting to me, my drive to support every single student be successful in the state of California would never diminish. If anything, it would grow larger. I think that I've shown that I am committed to education in my career that I've spanned over 15 years. In addition, I've done other independent work. I have a YouTube channel called Lily College Mythbusters. I've written a book called Not Getting Stuck, Success Stories of Being Latina and Transferring from a California Community College. I have a passion to serve in the educational pipeline. Whether or not I have 1,000 people reporting to me or 5 people, that is not going to change the work that I do.
Thank you. So, Tony, you're endorsed by the California Teachers Association. Endorsement from the CTA sometimes carries the criticism that you're in the pocket of teachers' interests. How do you respond to that criticism? And tell me if you've disagreed at all with the CTA in the past or currently.
The short answer is yes, I'm endorsed by CTA and teachers, and I endorse teachers. You can't have education without having great teachers who deserve professional development, who deserve training and coaching, and who deserve thank you for a very difficult job that they do. I'm also endorsed by California's nurses and firefighters and the California Democratic Party and Equality California and Planned Parenthood and Kamala Harris. And so we have a broad coalition of people who believe in our message about supporting every single kid. I'm not in anybody's pocket. And yes, I've disagreed with the Teachers Association and they tell me about it from time to time.
Tell me about that. What do you disagree? What have you disagreed on?
The California Teachers Association was opposed to the changing the school start time to later in the day. And I voted to support such legislation because there is research that proves, brain research that proves a later start time gives kids in middle school and high school a better experience, less stress, less likely to commit suicide or have other adverse effects. You know, my job is not to vote just because someone supports me. My job is to do what I've said for 11 years as an elected official, to vote in ways that would make my kids proud. And in 11 years, I've never had a sleepless night in politics. I love having support from various groups in the community. I tell them up front, that doesn't mean that you get my support or my vote on everything that we do. But I stand behind teachers. We can't have education without them, and I'm honored to bear their endorsement.
So, Tony, about 4 years ago, the Vergara lawsuit was a big challenge on teacher protections, on tenure and that sort of thing. Tell me how you feel currently about the time. Right now it takes about 2 years, a little bit less, about 16 months, for a teacher to get what is called tenure,
Yes.
job protections and that sort of thing.
Yes, sir.
Is that the right amount of time? Do we need more? Some states give significantly more time for teachers to get that tenure.
I think everyone agrees that having 3 years is probably better than 2 years.
So you would add a
I've
year.
actually introduced legislation that would call for 3 years. I've
Okay.
actually done that.
Okay.
What's different for me and others is that I have said that we should do this. Make the focus first, not on how you make it easier to fire somebody, how you make it easier to train somebody and coach somebody. I'm sorry, but not everybody's born knowing how to do classroom management, right?
Let's
And
get
so
to the other
I
candidates.
just think
Okay.
up front, the professional development, and if you're going to remove somebody from their employment, they deserve the right to have an appeal.
Okay.
And that's what I've said. But
Okay.
I've actually introduced legislation that would move teacher tenure to 3 years.
Okay. Lily, tell me, where do you stand on teacher tenure?
I think less than 3 years is really too little time to determine
What would you
whether or
move it
not a
to?
person has tenure. I think 3 years is a good amount of time or. But we do have to have professional development, and we do need to have the guidance as part of that process. I know that I've worked with tenured faculty, and they haven't had a good relationship with their tenure committee, and they've come to me as the dean to ask me what we need to do to make sure that they're getting through that process together. And so we've been able to work side by side, one-on-one, to go through a coaching process so that they understand what it takes for them to achieve tenure. Because it's true, nobody should be given that notice, oh, by the way, you weren't approved for tenure, and then they have no recourse. So I support faculty unions. I have fantastic relationships with the collective bargaining agreements that I've worked under, and I think it's a fantastic process for us to highlight those teachers who you know are going to really change the lives of our students. So I'm fully supporting tenure process, but it really should be at least a minimum 3-year process.
Okay, thanks. So, Marshall, 4 years ago, you were very supportive of the Vergara lawsuit. Tell me where you stand now on teacher tenure and how long it should be.
Yeah, I've been pretty consistent. I think first and foremost, schools are about students and teachers at the core of them, so we have to have a system that makes the most sense for teachers and for students. I've worked in schools very closely and know that our current system of a 2-year tenure, of layoffs only based on seniority, that has disproportionate impact on our highest poverty kids.
What would you change it to? How many years?
Dr. Shirley Weber, who's endorsed our campaign, I think the leading education leader in the legislature, she introduced legislation 4 years for tenure and a 5th year if it didn't make sense. By the way, very similar to the system in place at our community colleges right now. Community college, 4-year process, has to be earned.
You support 4 years?
Yes, and I support Dr. Weber's legislation.
Okay, thanks. Let's, once again, get your questions on some of the cards, and we're going to ask them. There we go. Thank you, David Plank. David Plank, as you all know.
Zervana.
All right. Last question from my list. Once again, I'll give you about a minute. The state superintendent doesn't run any schools, as you know, except the ones under state takeover. So there are currently, I think, about 4. I've done quite a bit of reporting on Inglewood Unified, who's under state takeover. Oakland, I believe, is still under state takeover, and Vallejo City is the other. Brief amount of time here. Marshall, what's your message to the residents in those communities? The state superintendent, California Department of Education, is overseeing their school district. They appoint a trustee, yes, but ultimately that's where the power is. What would you say to those communities about the schools?
Yeah, I'd say I'm the only candidate with a proven track record of actually turning around schools that are underperforming. And by having that person at the state level, you can be quite confident that we're going to go and turn around your schools. The state should run the very best schools, should be the model for school turnaround. And so we'll be very clear that we'll bring the same success we had at the partnership schools, double graduation rates, highest achievement of any school system in the state of California with the highest poverty kids. We're going to bring those same strategies to Inglewood, to Vallejo, and make sure all kids get what they deserve. That's why having an educator who's done the work versus just another politician is so critical for this role.
Lily, what's your, what would you say to those communities?
The first thing that you want to tell your community is that the school's not going to disappear, because I think that is the greatest fear. People move to neighborhoods because of the schools. People buy houses because of the schools. We invest millions of dollars because of our schools, but we need to know that they're being run right. And we need to know that there's community involvement, parent involvement, that there's the social support that that school will need for it to be successful. One of the issues that I have with charter schools and a lot of these independent schools is they're pulling out those families, they're pulling out that community, and that's the biggest issue that we're facing in education right now. We need involvement, we need participation, and what I would say to those schools that are facing those challenging situations is let's work together as one. Let's figure out a plan so this doesn't happen. Let's keep our school here. We know you need it. It was put there for a reason. Let's support it, and let's make sure we turn it around.
So, Tony, you represent the Oakland area. So what's your message to those schools under state takeover?
I've actually already been in touch with some of those districts. They've invited me, and they've asked me because they know when I became a school board member in West Contra Costa, that district had been under state control for almost 20 years. I'm proud to say that myself and my colleagues, and working with the community, we got that district restored to local control and out of debt early, and that we know how to get that done, and we will work with the folks in Inglewood and other communities to do the same thing by appointing an administrator who works closely with the community. You can't have one of these administrators who just comes in for a school board meeting and gives a few directives, sits in a closed session, and then bounces. You got to roll up your sleeve and go door to door, working with community folks, working with your students, and that's what we will do to support those districts. Make sure they get the resources, the leadership, and the oversight that they need to be successful.
Okay, thanks. So let's get to some of these audience questions. I'm going to give you a little less time on these because we got some good ones. So, Tony, let's stick with you, and we'll start with you, and we'll get the other candidates to respond. So, this one asks, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, state of New York spends just over $19,000 per student. California spends $9,000. Hopefully, somebody can fact check this. I'm assuming this is correct.
Sounds about right.
Per student. To equal New York's spending, California would need to raise $63.59 billion in revenue. Somebody please fact check that. So Tony, ultimately, it would have to, the legislature would have to allocate more money. So where's that money going to come from?
Well, I grew up in this state, and I was born in this state. What I love about California is California's been a leader. We should not let that gap intimidate us and say that we can't do it. Now, we may not be able to do it in a year or 4 years or 8, but we can start now. And the only way we're going to get there is ask those who've benefited from corporate tax loopholes and giveaways to pay their fair share. They've robbed our schools of the money that we need for public education, and we have to demand that they pay it. Now, there are proposals on the ballot in November that would bring $11 billion to our state if it passes. That would bring immediately $4 billion for K-12 education in our state. It's not 50 billion, did you say? But it's a good start, and I think California certainly can do it and should do it.
So Lily, tell me, where would the money come from to carry out some of the improvements that you've been talking about, like increasing teacher pay?
Okay, well, we really, as a state, need to face the facts about Proposition 13. And I think that we have been on a downhill slide ever since 1978 when that thing passed. And when that proposition passed, it was a backlash against a lot of other achievements that we were facing in the state of California. 1978, we had civil rights, we had all these changes happening, and then Proposition 13 happens, and it's a slap in the face to education and the children of this great state. We did not become the #1 state with revenue because our education was strong. And we need to get back to that point, not to roll things back, but to really re-examine the language of that proposition. One of the things I would support is a split roll tax. And that was something that we've talked about as proposals. And what that would mean is that the residential tax would remain the same, but then we would look at the commercial tax that's currently on the books. Because right now, if you have a change in ownership, I think it's over 51%, then that assessment needs to be completed again. And right now, that's not what's happening. And you have community members and business owners getting through the cracks, and that proposition has been a slap in the face for this whole time. So we can't get anywhere unless the people of California all work together as one, and get that proposition to be taken a look at and split off. Residential versus commercial real estate, we really need to analyze that.
So Marshall, where would you find the money, or where would you advocate finding the money to pay for some of these?
Yeah, my guess is everyone in this room agrees we need more funding for our schools. In our schools, we wouldn't have doubled graduation rates unless we had more funding for teacher professional development, for our parent college. So we have to look at how do we get more. First, let's move money from prisons to education. This state has dramatically increased spending in prisons over the last 3 decades, while actually not dramatically increasing funding. Cut prisons by 10%, you can fund pre-K for all. That is a political decision that elected leaders have not made for the last decade. Let's quit talking about it and actually making it. Second, cannabis. We just actually passed laws to make cannabis legal. There's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, probably billions in the future. I want that money to go to schools. And I want a state superintendent who's not going to be up there in Sacramento trading a little bit for this, a little bit for that. I want all of it for our kids and for public education. And then lastly, we got to look at the overall picture on Prop 13 on the corporate side, not the residential side, and think about movement there.
So this question, I'm going to paraphrase this question. So this question is saying that parents who enroll their kids in charter school are more engaged in their child's education and have to take more steps and are more active, and that advantages them, to be involved in their education. That's the kind of student that ends up enrolling in charter school. So how do you create a system? This is what the question is asking. How do you create a system that doesn't advantage kids whose parents can navigate that it's a complicated system. How do you create a system that doesn't give them the advantage?
Me first?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've worked in both a charter school environment and a district environment, so I think I'm in the right position to kind of say what policies make the most sense. And I remind people, magnet schools also have been a choice system. So we have over 120,000 kids in magnet schools in LA, and if anybody's actually tried to do that process, I'm a parent, I've looked at it, it is not easy. And I think the reality is a choice system, whether it be a magnet school or charter schools, does actually have one layer of choice, which actually brings up kind of requires engagement. So what do we actually do about that? What they did in other cities is they say, hey, in Denver, for example, they actually make sure all families know all the public school options, traditional district schools, magnet schools, charter schools, so there's not this choice aspect that just kind of requires certain placement in certain schools. That's how you leverage policy to actually ensure that you're seeing more distribution of students, new immigrants, English learners, special need kids across all of our schools. It's an area where we have, with focused policy, we have to do the work with always the focus being best school for every single kid.
Lily?
I think it comes down to communication. There are so many factors in your choice that as a parent you could be overwhelmed and often unaware of what your options are. I have a 14-year-old son. He's about to enter into the high school, and we had a parent orientation night where we were there to learn about what the college process was, what the career process was. And so many parents asked questions about whether or not the high school kids could take classes in the college because they wanted to see if they could earn college credit while they were also in the high school. And we have options for that. There's dual enrollment, cross enrollment, concurrent enrollment, but the parents don't understand what those processes are. And we see a lot of high schools wanting to do middle college or early college where they have high school classes taught at the college or college classes taught at the high school, and parents are seeking alternatives. But not all parents have the resources or the know-how to navigate that system. What I would propose is that we have something called a parent center at every school district where they can have access to an educational advisor or counselor to help them navigate what their system and their district has. I've seen some high schools with parent centers, and I think that's a wonderful opportunity for parents to be involved. And also a parent portal. So that's something online, something within the district, something that they can navigate. And then also having regular communication with your superintendent at the local level. We have district superintendents, we have county superintendents, and then we have the state superintendent. How many times have you received a communication from your county superintendent or your district superintendent to let you know what those options are? Our students are savvy. They know what's out there. But we need to get the parents involved and we need the community involved.
Thanks, Lily. So what would you do to help these parents out?
I would echo Lily's comments about how we engage parents, and sometimes schools can be intimidating. If you think about, for some parents, what their own experience has been, they're not always in a position to help their students. They don't know what options are available. We should make sure that these great programs, they're not just in some schools, they should be in all schools, and work with our families so they can be engaged. It's why I put so much focus on creating full-service community schools. The school should be the center for the community, the center for the family, the center for parents and students. And we do as much parent engagement to support our families. Now, that might need to look like adult education and adult school programs, so parents can learn more to support themselves so they can be more engaged in their child's life. And I think that we ought to double down in those programs, double down in our parent engagement, and double down in full-service community schools to help our families and our students.
Okay. This question is proof that we have some researchers in the house, and this is just quick response from each of you. Which educational research study did you read most recently, and who was the author? You first, Marshall.
Well, I think right now, I think the Learning Policy Institute, in terms of all the stuff they've been pushing forward on both teacher shortage, but also conditions for teachers. Obviously, Linda Darling-Hammond, the point person, but that entire team over there, I think, has done phenomenal stuff.
All
A real
right.
roadmap for teachers.
Okay, most recent educational research study and the author?
You know, you're like catching me at a loss here. I read educational research journals all the time. I read a lot of resources from EdSource, and of course, the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I do a journal of teacher learning. I don't know where I would point to because it's sort of like a daily routine that you're digesting so much information.
Okay.
But
Okay. Tony?
I guess Marshall and I do agree on something. I would agree that the Learning Policy Institute and Linda Darling-Hammond, she is our foremost expert on education. I'm actually introducing a bill this year that she has sponsored, and I'm happy to talk with her and meet with her on a regular.
And this is related, this question is reminding me that we didn't get a concrete answer from you guys. So would you publicly support a ballot initiative to amend Prop 13 so state can tax commercial property using current market value? Marshall?
Yeah, I think the details are always what matters, so I don't say yes to anything, but the concept of like additional taxes on corporate, yeah.
Yeah. Lily?
exactly, it has to be in the details, but if we could have that conversation, I would 100% support that.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so let's, here's a good one. Yeah, we had this question previously. So API is gone, Academic Performance Index. Some reporters are happy about that. Some reporters are very happy with this new California dashboard. But some people say that it needs improvement. Tony, how would you improve the new California dashboard, which I'm sure many of you know, but it's the new way to measure the effectiveness of public schools, multicolors and dials and everything. I haven't looked at it in a while, but how would you improve it?
I think it's a good start. I think our kids are more than a test score, and I appreciate that the dashboard recognizes that we have to look at everything from school climate to dealing with attendance issues. We also have to look at preparation of our teachers, and what I hear consistently from our teachers is that they have not been given training to actually support students towards the new state standards that we have, and I think that we have to be honest. And so I'd like to give the dashboard a try. We're holding our first statewide conversation on closing the achievement gap at the end of this month, where we'll be talking to districts about how they feel impacted by the dashboard. We'll be listening for their feedback about ways to make those changes.
Lily, how would you change the dashboard?
Well, I don't know if more data is on there, but every time I go on there, there's a lot of no information. A lot of schools, I don't think, have been reporting. I think there needs to be a lot of conversations around how that data is reported. There needs to be support so that make sure there's a point person, that it's not something where, oh, Joe's doing it. Joe's like, I'm not doing it, Sarah's doing it. And Sarah says, well, we thought you were doing it. So we need information on there. I mean, we need to make sure it's up to date. We need to make sure everyone's participating, that it's accurate, that it's reflective. I also want to hear from the students. I want to see the student voices involved. I want to know what they think about what their experience is. And I also want to see the data points that they're using, because our students go from school to school, city to city. We have a lot of student swirl, what I call, where the students are enrolling in one high school, then another high school, then another place. And we need to be having accurate data of how long has your student been here? How long has your student been in the district? I'd like to see more demographic information that way. And I'd like to also see more qualitative information as well. A lot of it is just single snapshot pictures, and I think we need to have that meaty, rich, descriptive data to really be able to do anything with it. We want to be able to do some predictive analytics. We want to be able to dip into research and maybe do some forecasting. We may be able to plan some things in advance. And right now, I just don't see it having as much rigor as it could and as much participation as it needs to have.
Thanks. Marshall, how would you change it?
Yeah, so we started working at the most challenging schools in LA in 2008. One of the first things we did was we created a parent report card. And we did it by having a bunch of parents get together over and over again and tell us what's the most effective information for you. And that was the foundational point for the feedback we gave to our parents. So I think with the dashboard right now, it needs to be more user-friendly for our families. There's some work to be done there. We have to listen to our families and also listen to the educators on how does it make sense for them. Secondly, I'd like to see data that's more comparative. So I said, I have a son who's in our local public school. I want to see not just how his school is doing, but how's his school doing compared to other schools like his school with similar students? Because that helps us actually learn as fast as possible and grow in our schools. And that's something that the state should be phenomenal at helping schools get better. To do that, we need to have information not just about individual schools, but actually about how our schools compared to other schools so we can learn and grow faster.
Okay. This is a question that goes back to local control funding formula. So the Governor Brown opposed a bill for fiscal transparency, disaggregated by subgroup and required by every LEA. So I'm assuming that means that the equity in spending based on the subgroup, would have been public information. What will you do to ensure increased local control funding formula transparency and support from the governor's office? Marshall?
So we need to have transparency. I think if we want the public to invest more in public schools, which they need to see where the money is actually going, and we have to learn from it. So right now, we pass all this additional money, but we don't know, is it actually going to students of greatest need, and what strategies are being used to improve schools, right? It's all about how do you improve. I want to find out if a school district has certain amounts of money, how did they spend it? Did they invest more in principals, more professional development for teachers? Did they extend the class day? What strategies did they actually utilize that led to strong improvements in graduation rates and student achievement? And then we can learn from that and share that across schools and school districts. That's not possible right now because we actually do not require districts to show where is the money going and what is the impact on kids, which is always the key question no matter what action we are taking. What is the impact on children? Let's do what works for kids.
Lily, do you think the public knows enough about local control funding formula and how it's being carried out by school districts?
I think our districts are doing a really good job of getting involvement, but I still think it's one of those things that's a mystery. When you ask the average parent, what does that really mean to you specifically? How does it impact your life? And I think it's really hard to quantify those budgets, like Marshall was saying. How do we make that into an outcome? How do we make that statement tie budget to planning? But the other issue, like Marshall was saying, is in actual expenditures. You can have a budget that looks as beautiful as can be, and by the end of the year, your expenditures tell the real story. And we really need to make sure that the parents are actively involved and that they're throughout each step of the process and then seeing what those end results are. I know in the state of California in our ed code, we have certain limitations on how much money is spent on instruction versus non-instructional expenses and how much we could spend for supplemental instruction or part-time workers or volunteer even, whether or not that's included. We don't know how that's tied to actual student success. So part of the issue is explaining and illuminating and articulating that for the parents to understand this is going to affect you this way and make that real understandable. And right now, that's not out there.
So Tony, what's your take and how would you change things?
Marshall mentioned Dr. Weber, and she has a piece of legislation this year that would say create a set amount of LCFF dollars to go to support students who have been underserved, like African-American students, which I look forward to supporting. I fully support transparency. I'm pretty sure I voted for that piece of legislation that the governor vetoed, and I'd be happy to vote for it again.
Okay. So this question, as we start to wrap up, this question goes to the issue of early childhood education. So let me ask you, Tony, from the state superintendent's office, what's left to do? Transitional kindergarten is a very important reform in recent years, but what can the Office of State Superintendent do to improve early childhood education, which the research shows, will show dividends later on?
I think we should just pay for it. We've been talking about it for decades and saying it's cheaper to send someone to Harvard for them to end up in the criminal justice system. And if we provided universal preschool, that we would achieve that. We've done a lot of talking about it. Let's be about it now. Let's provide the money and have universal preschool in our state. The legislature has been slowly getting there. We spent probably $500 million just to increase what we spend in early education, but it's not enough. The achievement gap starts at birth, and we need to do a much better job of making sure that we provide early education for all our kids. That's what I'll fight for. That's why I put the prison tax bill into effect so we can have more money for our preschool programs in the state.
So Lily, what's left to be done on early childhood ed from the CDE?
I don't think early childhood education is going far enough. There's a huge difference between a daycare center and a child development center. There's a huge difference for a single mother if she can get daycare before school as well as after school so that they can have an actual job. I can't tell you how many parents are on welfare because they don't have daycare. And one of the biggest issues is before school and after school care. So if we're talking about pulling our families together and pulling our families into the education system, we need to respond to the issues that are currently out there. So we need to have education around what is early childhood education, talking about child development, talking about the pre-K system, but then also addressing it on the back end so that those kids who are latchkey kids have a place for them to go so they're not out on the streets getting in trouble. We need to have extended care at every school and every district.
Marshall?
Yeah, I think pre-K is a huge equity issue, and I get a good example where Sacramento politicians keep failing us. So equity, every person who has resources sends their child to pre-K. And so if it's good enough for some kids, it's good enough for all kids, and it's time to shift that. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that a legislature has voted for 3 raises for correction officers in the last 7 years, but hasn't funded pre-K for all? Like, how is that possible? It's possible because special interests are dominating Sacramento, and that's what has to change. We need people who are going to put kids first, no matter what, to make these decisions, to get things like pre-K for all actually done.
Okay. So the last one, this is such an important issue. So educators are feeling the impact of recent changes to student suspension laws. What would you do, and the question goes on to say, as SPI, what does SPI stand for?
State Superintendent Public Instruction.
Challenge number 1 with this rule.
First thing we're going to do is change
I
that
hate
name to
acronyms.
something meaningful.
Public radio hates acronyms. How will you balance the rights of students with the ability of educators to remove disruptive students? And should charter schools follow the same suspension laws? Let's just give you 30 seconds. Marshall?
I think a good example of where a state superintendent who's been an educator can drive change. So we moved towards having less suspensions, which is a good thing. But we didn't give any training to our principals and teachers and counselors. What do you do now with students? So what do we do in our schools? We actually created a separate classroom for kids. Rather than suspending them and sending them home, we had strong educators with counseling support in the classroom, helping those young people on campus so they were actually learning. And what you want the state to be doing is making sure other school districts and schools understand how to actually provide supports to young people rather than sending them home where it may not make sense in that traditional classroom environment, with far more counseling support, and have your most effective teachers in that classroom helping those young people.
Lily, I hear from teachers who say, my hands are tied, suspending these students because of district pushes to reduce suspensions. How would you change things, if at all?
Well, there needs to be more research on what's really happening, and we need to look and see if there are some trends or some patterns, because I think we could maybe know, and I know I've seen this, where certain faculty have exchanges with students at a much different rate than other faculty, and we need to do some professional development. And that needs to happen with the instructors as well as with support staff. I love the idea of restorative justice, and that we give the student an opportunity for them to learn what they're doing and learn how their behavior impacts other people, but we also need to look at the instructor and offer them support as well.
Okay, Tony?
You know, when I was a school board member, we reduced our suspensions in 1 year by 27% using restorative justice, because when kids get pushed out, they can't learn. When I was a school board member, I voted against expulsions almost every meeting, because if you don't have a plan for how to restore a student back to the community so that he or she has a way to learn, all you're doing is pushing them into the criminal justice system. This past year, I taught a group of high school students who were in a juvenile camp, and I brought Apple into that juvenile camp to teach them how to do coding. You shouldn't have to get arrested in this state to learn how to do something like coding in this state. And so we have to tackle our suspensions and our expulsions. Restorative justice is part of it. The other piece of it is we should stop allowing and asking school resource officers to be the school disciplinarians. We have to build real systems to support. When you do that, what you're doing is you're criminalizing kids by having a police officer come to do the disciplinary work that should be happening by the appropriate deans and folks on the campus.
Thank you.
We have to build a complete system, and I'm very proud. We got to give resources too, Adolfo, and I'm proud that my bill gave $35 million to our school districts
Thanks.
to actually do just what this question's asking about.
And so with that, let's thank Tony Thurman, Dr. Lily Ploski, and Marshall Cutt. And thank you to USC, and there's a reception afterwards. David Plank.
Okay, well, Adolfo has just said what I was going to say, but I will say it anyway. I want to thank the candidates. I particularly want to thank Adolfo Guzman-Lopez, who did a terrific job as moderator and has been doing a great job for a long time. I want to thank Dean Karen Sims Gallagher for hosting this event. And I want to congratulate my colleagues in the Center for Education Policy, Equity, and Governance, which I think is going to be a powerful voice, not only in Los Angeles, but in the state of California for improvements in the quality of education in our state. And with that, I'll introduce myself last. I'm David Plank from Policy Analysis for California Education, and I want to thank you also for coming today. I think these kinds of forums are extraordinarily informative for all of us as we make choices that matter for children in California, and I thank you very much for coming. And now, enjoy the reception.